First thing I would like to do is basically take you back to January 2020 BC. That's before COVID. We had polarized politics. We had income inequality that was nearly the highest in 50 years' time. We had surveillance capitalism and disinformation. Even the mighty Margaret at the EU couldn't make big tech companies behave. We've actually built 1,000 kilometers of walls around Europe. Citizen Sophia became the first robot to become a citizen, and we're all scared about what AI might do for jobs. Bubbling underneath is the resistance to antibiotics and all the challenges that could bring to healthcare. We passed the point of no return in terms of the melting of the ice caps. We had pollution killing almost 9% of global death. Food and water insecurity in places like Singapore, places like that rely on 90% of their food and water to come from outside the city. We had some fundamental things failing, like neoliberalism, where big companies, multinational companies, are failing and causing massive disruptions to the local economies that they're operating in. And we have 39% of global emissions coming out from industries like construction. Then this happened. I think what COVID has done is almost acted as a global X-ray, showing the inadequacy and the codependency of our systems. But it's okay. We have a vaccine, or is it? I'm not sure. In order to answer that question, let me take you to 10 years ahead from now, January 2030, post-COVID. The population of the planet will be nearly 9 billion. Not all of them are going to be able to do cool, creative jobs that are not driven by AI. 95% of urban expansion will be into cities. India, for example, will need 11 new Delhis to cope with the growth in population. Places like Egypt will be the 7th largest economy. Advanced robotics and AI will mean that we'll be able to automate a significant part of healthcare. Even robots will be able to do surgeries. The race to decarbonization and zero carbons will be well on its way. Even companies like Airbus will be making things that look like planes that actually zero in terms of their carbon emissions. The Northern Hemisphere, the naughty North, will need to completely decarbonize by then in order to avoid catastrophic climate change. The sunny South will need to start using all of that amazing sunshine in order to generate energy. There are actually abundant resources around us, not on this planet, but nearby. By then, we should be able to start mining asteroids near us and actually get massive resources back to Earth. So this is a really big picture, you know, the past and the present and the future. But how does this impact designing cities? So I have 3 principles I want to share with you today. The most important one and the starting point is design for the citizen and from the citizen up. The single organizing principle here is that we have to build cities around people and around communities. And allow me to propose a slightly difficult question. How can they be the best version of themselves? How can we make those citizens able to grow and be as fulfilled as possible? The challenge with designing cities is that typically it's a top-down process. Centralization, command and control, the science of smart cities comes from the top. You don't have to ask for what we want. We will tell you what you want. It's all built around systems and smart technology and whatnot. But the art of social urbanism and actually looking at how people will really live in a city, there is a sense of decentralization, a sense of sense and respond. Basically, people tell the city what they want and the city responds. quite a lot of the big design projects are driven by architects. Somebody from big architecture are building an AI city in China where even your breakfast is chosen for you by the AI. Everything is hyper connected, super connected. Could be good, but it's not exactly responsive. Where is the human autonomy in all of this? Quite a lot of smart city design is driven by big tech. Recently, you might have heard that Sidewalk Labs by Google has been shut down, or at least Google has decided to leave the project. They intended to build it from the internet up. They wanted to go super connected with lots of sensors and lots of impact on privacy and what's going on within the city. Actually, they had a lot of resistance from people and from the community. Imagine living inside a search engine. Big consulting are big drivers for the smart city discussions and smart city design. They estimate something like 2.5 trillion in projected smart city revenues across the world. To give you an example, in the UK, 2.6 billion in consulting fees in the UK from the UK government go only to 8 consultancies. This is not just for cities, but for a variety of government projects. So there are really big, heavy players taking kind of a leading role in actually how cities are designed. But let's take back a step and let's go back to the citizen. In my research and teaching within Queen Mary University of London, in collaboration with the students and the professors there, we've done a little bit of a survey to ask people, what do they want from the city? What makes their city the most livable and the most interesting? And this was across a variety of audiences and a variety of target groups in multiple countries. And 3 things came out. People want to live in an environmentally friendly place that actually cares for the environment. There's lots of greenery, there is lots of ecology in the way that their city behaves. They value social interaction and being able to have a sense of belonging where they live, a sense of community, a sense of civic pride and identity. And last but not least, they want an opportunity to grow, to be the best version of themselves, whether that opportunity is intellectual, professional, economic, or family-based. Interestingly, nobody asked for a city built from the internet up. If you look at developments in my city, such as London, historically places like Canary Wharf, which reinvented the dock side of London, quite a lot of these big, massive corporation finance-led companies operate there. But historically, they've actually created almost an island that is surrounded literally by private security. You get searched on the way in and sometimes on the way out. And if you look at the neighborhoods around it, there was zero value to them. All the value was built into these big properties and these big developments. Nearby where I live, there is a whole bunch of new developments that are effectively acting as gold bars to invest in. There is zero sense of community being considered to just really big buildings, often without playgrounds and without any consideration for the local community. So when big developers move in and develop these assets, typically they tend to be at the expense of neighborhoods and locales. I even read somewhere that somebody wants to build a blockchain city in the desert, a Silicon Valley entrepreneur. And typically when you talk about designing cities and building cities, you get all of this tech talk about sensors and data and analytics. And don't get me wrong, I am a technologist, and I think there is value and role for them. But this cannot possibly be the ultimate ambition of building a city. I think we need to think about something else. A different stack is what I call a citizen needs stack. At a practical level, they need access, they need opportunity, they need to reduce their costs, they need to be able to breathe clean air. There needs to be a sense of passion, wellness, attractiveness, style, nostalgia. There needs to be purpose, there needs to be power, they need to be able to kind of be the best versions of themselves. Almost apply the Maslow hierarchy of needs into the requirements of citizens from a city. Meanwhile, in Denmark, as always the case be with all Danish projects. Nordhaven, they're building exactly a similar type of project around the harbor. And the fundamental question that's driving what they're doing is, how do we develop the area for the people? They're extremely conscious of where people meet and how they use the place and collaborate and have businesses there from the outset, local businesses, small businesses, as well as transforming the environment and creating a very child-friendly, very family-friendly. Completely different story to Sidewalk Labs. They're building from the people up. Helsinki, which recently won an award for being one of the most innovative cities in Europe, has a really interesting approach. They talk about anticipating people's need and providing services on their terms, as the mayor says there. They're totally user-driven in their approach, huge collaborations with the citizens, and they have multiple open innovation programs that allow the city to kind of develop and prosper. So if we are talking about smart citizens, what do we really mean and how do we do that? This is a very basic framework I would like to propose. Citizens need to be extremely well connected. They need to be innovative and entrepreneurial, able to participate in their own destiny, whether financial or economical. They're able to participate actively in their governance and continuously, not just once a year when they vote. They're technologically savvy. They have fantastic ability to leverage new capabilities. They're environmentally conscious and they're empowered. If you imagine your city has people who have scored very highly on all of these items, on all of these metrics, you will actually have a smart city. You will have a very versatile city. So how do you do that? The second principle I would like to propose is design platforms across the ecosystem. And what I mean by ecosystem is not just transport or healthcare or any of those things, but actually a step above that. It's the environment, it's the society, and it's the economy, the cornerstones of what would make an ecosystem in the city works. See, the challenges, quite a lot of these projects, they tend to be almost a small section of one of those items, but they're not necessarily interconnected. Take electric vehicles, for example. Fantastic. You know, they're a great step towards decarbonization and the non-reliance on fossil fuel. But they need energy. Where is that energy going to come from? There's a system around that. There's a value chain around that. And having this helicopter view is going to be vital. There needs to be some sort of central coordination at the very least. So what we need to change here is we need to change the system, not the silo. Again, let's go back to Helsinki. They talk a lot about flattening the hierarchy. Cities must act as platforms for innovations and tests. So the city itself becomes this experimental playground where different players have the ability to reach and connect with each other, with huge emphasis on local companies and local population and local capability. The culture of experimentation and collaboration with the citizens will allow the city to connect the dots, to join up the thinking. So projects are not happening in isolation of each other. There is an understanding of where items fit into the bigger picture. Another big example in the UK is something called the Preston model. This was a small industrial town that was typically driven by an industrial economy. But since things have moved offshore, the town needed to kind of reinvent, its economic model. So they did this all on their own, first and foremost. They actually did that completely within the local council and with the local mayor and the people involved. They didn't go and get central government to support them or do anything. They did a few things. They decided to hyper-localize. They used the local economic assets to revitalize the economy. The term they used is, how can we build community wealth by working with local anchor stakeholders and neighbors? So they basically connected the dots between things like schools, universities, research institutions, local businesses, to try and give them the work that typically would have gone elsewhere. They initiate initiated procurement systems that favors local companies, interests, and solutions. If you remember the example I had earlier about Carillion, this big facilities company that went bankrupt, and it was a big multinational that basically siphoned all the profits elsewhere. All of that got changed in Preston. Everything became fundamentally local, or at least to drive local value. They effectively switched off privatization and outsourcing and revitalized the economy, most importantly, providing jobs and know-how, bringing entire value chains and manufacturing into their regions and into their neighborhoods. You remember I mentioned about food and Singapore's reliance, 90% reliance on food imports. Well, in the future, and this is already happening in Singapore, starting now, they are looking at self-sufficiency in food and water. There's a company there called Shiok Meats, which is creating lab-grown shrimps. And they aim to get to 30% of food self-sufficiency from a 90% dependency by 2030. Things like cellular agriculture, synthetic foods have huge implications not only on food insecurity, but on the environment. To give you an example, synthetic meats consume 99% less land, 45% less energy, 96% less water, and 96% less emissions. So there is a massive revolution, not only just in the food itself, but the entire system that goes around it. 70% of the price you pay for an ingredient in the supermarket is actually in the logistics and the packaging and the transportation, as opposed to the actual cost of farming it, which is typically somewhere else. Anyone who has children might recognize that this, my child recently told me that he thinks that chicken come from the supermarket. And I had to explain to him that no, they come from somewhere else, less friendly. So when we are looking at changing the system, there are three key things that need to happen. I already mentioned starting with the people, giving them equality, equity, entrepreneurship, and equal opportunity. But also we need to think about the policy, how we procure services in the city, how do we design things, who gets to do the work, how does that affect the speed at which we can do change. Anyone who's been involved in government projects, they can take quite a long time to actually deliver anything, and by the time you've done it, it's almost too late. So how can we add speed to procurement and policy and design and change? How do we build self-sufficiency and create systematic change around what we do from an authority perspective? The practice, the processes that we use, typically things take a very long time. I've been involved in a project recently which took 1.5 years to write a piece of government policy. But needless to say, we need to have something a little bit quicker than that. And if we want these policies to be practical and effective, we need collective, experimental, flatter mindset, flattening the hierarchy, even flattening the shapes of the city. We need a framework for changing the ecosystem. And these three things need to ladder up to one fundamental thing. Are we creating public goods and value? Is this going to go back to our community, or is it going to get siphoned off into some global corporation elsewhere? To what purpose? So I'll return to the future, as it were. I think if you put a 10-year horizon lens and you start from 10 years onwards and work backwards, you kind of need to design for a higher purpose. It's not just about putting some sensors into your neighborhood or creating a slightly better waste system. You really need to think bigger than that. There are significant opportunities in the next 10 years. I've already mentioned a couple of them. But let me put some provocations out there for you. You don't necessarily have to agree with this. But imagine if we had universal basic services. As the codification of knowledge and automation of work begin to take effect, scarcity that drives capitalism might be redundant, and with it, capitalism as we know it. But this requires interplanetary coordination. The good news is that cities and regions will always be the prototypes for bigger ambitions. It's interesting how a tiny little town like Preston was able to kind of change their economy almost single-handedly and without government intervention. Same with Helsinki. It's not very big, but they're still able to kind of flatten the environment and flatten the communication and create a collaborative model. Bigger things are going to happen. It is not inconceivable that basic free housing, education, information, and healthcare can be provided at scale and at lower costs. A lot of people are scared of automation and AI and whatnot. And I'm not saying that this is the solution, but think of taxing the robots, not the citizens, for example, where these abundant technologies and super efficient technologies will allow us, will actually liberate us to be able to have, you know, free education and healthcare and the digitization of quite a lot of services that currently actually cost quite a lot. So driven by the digitization of all these areas, we should be able to reduce the cost of service and hence empowering citizens to pursue the better versions of themselves. I think there is a bigger horizon of what people could be, apart from trying to balance their work with their life and often failing at doing so. So if I go back to this society, environment, economy model with the citizen at its heart, imagine this. What if we built citizen platforms that have a higher purpose? Platforms that eradicate disease, democratize education and opportunity, close the economic and social gaps, localize and virtualize industry, offer free housing, decarbonize, and rewild. These are the sorts of ambitions that we should be having. And you might say, that sounds too grand and it's too difficult. Well, I beg to differ. Let me give you a small micro example. We worked with Dubai Ambulance on trying to optimize the response time of ambulances getting to accidents, and in particular, heart attacks. And in order to change the entire system, we were able to look at a number of data points that allowed us not only to optimize the route, which is a classic smart city kind of challenge in terms of mobility, we were able to combine citizen health data, historical data around cardiac arrests, the places where these things happen, not only to optimize the journeys of the ambulance services, but also to start working at the intervention points, whether that's education or whether that is actually interventions at the point of care where things happen in people's homes. There's a lot that goes into this particular example, but in essence, we didn't just look at the single question of how can we get the ambulance there quicker. We tried to answer a bigger question, which is how can we reduce heart attacks in the first place and minimize the time it takes to deliver that treatment. Another example was looking at, if you know enough about the future of the city and you know enough about where the industries of the future are going to be, you might be able to work backwards into things like education, training, and jobs. So in this concept, we looked at creating a platform where we are matching individual kind of desires and needs and what people want in terms of their careers and their lifestyles with the potential of the city as the city goes into various industries and as it goes into various opportunities. We match those with what the citizens might be wanting at an individual level, suggesting training, jobs, opportunities for investment, and actually giving them a lot more control, almost a dashboard for their life that is not just done at an individual level, but in relation to the city. One of our clients is St. James's Quarter in Edinburgh, and they're doing amazing work building a new center for the city. But what's fascinating about that, apart from the fantastic new location, is actually they had, from day one, they had a full ecosystem strategy, virtualizing all physical services, enabling and collaborating with various stakeholders in the city in order to be able to provide education, training, jobs, incomes, but also almost detaching from the physical location and translating what they're doing in the physical location into a much bigger, wider, virtual kind of economy. This is not as big as the e-citizenship program in Estonia, but this idea of virtualizing your city is actually quite powerful. If what you're doing in a small location can actually translate into this big global economy, that can create a lot of value. And I wish I could share the numbers, but perhaps later on. There is actually huge potential for doing that. One other example, I'm going to mention two quick examples before I close, but essentially, if you look at some of the technologies that allow us to have bespoke medicine, for example, this is a concept that we were developing for Philips, looking at how can we create 3D printed vitamins based on your genome, your lifestyle, and other factors. Quite a lot of these technologies are actually preventative as the world of medicine moves from intervention to prevention. We have huge opportunities to actually eradicate disease and minimize conditions and actually work with people at an individual level. As new advances in sensors and data and science around that, we, in the next 10 years, we should be able to actually get rid of quite a lot of stuff that is actually stopping us. To give you a quick idea, the volume of scientific research doubles every 10 years, in fact, every 9 years. So by 2030, all the knowledge, all the PhDs we have, all the scientific papers we have today would have been doubled by 2030, which means that there is huge potential to actually do much bigger things. Last but not least, people talk about construction. This was a conceptual project that we did with Hypercell and MIT. We were looking at something called self-assembly architecture, which is essentially robotic bricks that you can program en masse in order to create different shapes and move those different shapes. So the idea of creating a fixed structure no longer and in the future could actually be fundamentally questioned. Imagine a building that builds itself or a building that moves itself. This can bring a whole new meaning to how we can design and modularize and create different environments within our cities to adapt, to be more resilient, not just widening footpaths. So I think there's an opportunity to embrace the industries of the future, making your city a pioneer in future knowledge economies. You've got space, agriculture, food, energy, mobility, security, construction, genetics. These are all interesting and fantastic areas that we will see massive leaps in the next 10 years. So if you're designing a city or redesigning a city for the future, these are definitely a good start. The interesting thing about all of this is that when you talk about redesigning cities, there is this idea that you almost design it and build it and that's it. But the reality is that there is no finish line and it never stops. So you need to build a citywide ecosystem of innovation to radically experiment and prototype and recreate some of these advanced futures. My final point is this. If you look at what I've discussed and what I shared with you so far, and you cast your mind to how cities are designed, they're typically designed almost as factories for living. These big machines where humans are the cogs and they have to fit in the right place. But actually, the metaphor I would like to suggest going forward is rather than factories for livings, let's look at cities as civilized jungles. As one of my students at Queen Mary said, it would be interesting to combine the best of nature with the best of technology in order to create something that's a lot more ecological, a lot more practical, and a lot more sustainable. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was enlightening. There's so many things that are here to discuss. I would actually start with something that you ended with, which is this constant, let's call it, a need to redesign. So designing or redesigning a city doesn't end, as you pointed out. So this constant redesign, what does it need especially when we talk about the leadership of a city, which is most of the times political and changing often?
So I think the challenge with having elections that change every 4 years or over a certain period of time, that puts almost an artificial timeline on things where projects will be initiated and where projects will be completed, has a huge impact, subconsciously perhaps, or even consciously, on when things will be done. So it creates a different timeline to, the world timeline as what's happening in the world. So I think one of the fundamental principles I'm suggesting in here when I said citizens need to participate in their own governance is that it needs to be an ongoing process, an iterative process, almost a design process that continuously is experimenting and developing and doing things. You need to create changes in the policy and in the procurement of these things. So if you look at the Helsinki example, they have this massive platform. They have 750 local companies participating on an ongoing basis on a number of projects. All of these are, they gladly, they openly say that these are experiments. We don't know where they're going to end, but they're experiments. But we're collaborating on finding these solutions because the challenges keep coming up and the improvements need coming up. So it's not like you're just going to design a place and fix it and that's it. Take any of those harbor projects where, they're trying to set things in stone, literally, or concrete for that matter. But if you look at some of the technologies I talked about towards the end with things like self-assembly architecture and morphology and modularization of space and multi-purposing of space, the very physical environment itself is going to change. So if we can change that, and future technologies will allow us to change that, surely we should change our political kind of model in order to be able to adjust and improve and speed up experimentation and speed up prototyping of these models in order to get to better solutions.
A question from a very good friend of ours, Mihai. One of the challenges today in cities, but not only, refers to lots of inequalities. The redesigning you are proposing is not something most of the cities can afford or think of. Doesn't this approach contribute to even higher inequalities?
On the contrary, I think if I look at the Preston example I mentioned earlier, the massive inequality was that they were reliant on external, on their economy was driven by external mechanisms, things that are actually outside of their control. So what they did was, how can we bring some of the basics back home? How can we localize our flow of income so that money is not going out, money is actually circulating within the local economy as much as possible. And that meant creating the ability for local businesses to contribute to all of the government projects and able to pitch for them and able to procure for them. So effectively, they enabled their own citizens, their own workers to have that opportunity in order to kind of grow their economy. The cost of experimentation is also interesting, if that's what the gentleman is asking about. I think it's a lot more interesting to think about experiments as ways of mitigating future risk. You're trying to minimize the cost of building something massive that doesn't go anywhere by having this core design principle, collaborating with your citizens, asking them what they think, getting them involved in the design process, getting them involved in the testing process. All of that will help mitigate against the future. If you look at the Sidewalk Labs project, millions got spent on that after years, and now they pulled out. And what we're left with? Unhappy citizens, wasted money, and no real relationship between the developer and the technology partner with the citizens. And even though there has been a lot of kind of like discussion and resentment towards some of the suggested approaches, it was too little too late. So what I'm suggesting by involving citizens and changing the ecosystem and looking at how you can bring things home, literally, I would argue, is actually saves you money rather than costs you money. Makes you money.
I fully agree. I have a question related to competition. We live in a world we used to live in a world which was mainly defined by competition between countries or regions. But I think we're also in a world defined by competition between cities for one of the key resources, which is people. How do you redesign a city to make it more competitive to other cities? And what do you need to offer, or do you need to strategically redesign a city to get a certain type of people, if you like, to attract a certain type of people?
So I think the segmentation question is quite hard. It's a really good question, Cyprian. I think any city in the world is trying to do that. Any city in the world is trying to get the best talent possible to kind of go and live and thrive there. But typically that is done using, classical incentives, whether it's, if you think about the Estonia model, where you can, leverage the system and be a citizen there and kind of effectively save a little bit of money and be a little bit more practical in doing things. So you would be able to kind of leverage classical incentives to do that. But if you think of the Estonian model, what they're doing is that they actually said, look, you don't even have to be here, but you can still, benefit from what is going on in here. The same with St. James's Quarter example that I was trying to describe earlier. Although they're building something in that city, they're actually, the digital roadmap and digital technology enables anyone in Scotland to participate in the economic generation of that. So the assumption here is that you're trying to bring people in. What if you don't have to bring them in? What if they can go and work in their, beautiful countryside home, but still, benefit from the digital infrastructure or the opportunity infrastructure they provide for them? So the first thing I would challenge is that this paradigm of let's bring people here might not necessarily be the right one anymore. Certainly in the way the world is heading right now. If you think about how, centralized, the center of the city where, big business and big economy and all of that is kind of like concentrated, it's all hollowed out because of COVID. Maybe it will change when the vaccine kind of kicks in, but people now are genuinely, I know at least 3 business owners who left an entire country to go and live in another country simply because the quality of life is much better, but they're still able to do everything else that they did before. Yeah. So I think this false utopia principle of I'm going to build the ultimate city and let's bring people into it and have a whole bunch of incentives around it might not even necessarily be the right thing anymore. However, if you still want to do that and you want to bring people in, I'll go back to my kind of organizing principle. Why does this city allow me to be the best version of myself? If my city can't answer that question through what it does in terms of the environment, in terms of society, and in terms of opportunity, then I'm not going to be the best version of myself. I'm going to go elsewhere. And if you're going to be even more sophisticated, you say to yourself, okay, who are the types of people that we want? And then you really sit down with them and work with them on what really matters. I've been involved in so many different projects where government policy has been set over here, and almost 2 years later asking citizens what they think, and it's too late. So you need to kind of close that gap and talk to those people and work out what do they really need from your city before you can even, don't build it and expect them to come. Hardly ever works. There's plenty of examples where that didn't happen.
It's the same with entrepreneurship. The main reason why startups fail is that they build something nobody wants. So perhaps we start building cities for the clients of the cities as well. We have a question from India. He says, very thankful for mentioning their challenges as well. So Vijay says, I live in a city that is highly polluted, overcrowded, and it will continue to be so. How do you redesign where it's really bad, unlike cities like Dubai, where I guess you have, didn't finish, where you have more resources, of course, and perhaps a different type of time ahead. So how do you take a city in India or in Eastern Europe, for that matter, and how do you redesign a city like Bucharest or Belgrade, there's many examples of cities in Eastern Europe that are highly polluted and overcrowded.
Right. So there is the philosophical answer and there's the practical answer. The philosophical answer is I'm actually looking to do some work in India around redesign, around solving exactly the same problems that the gentleman is asking about, namely pollution and waste. So the philosophical thing is that all the Indian experts that I'm working with, when they've done the research and actually sat down with the local population and say, would you like a better waste system? Would you like less pollution and less traffic and things like that? Of course, the answer was yes. Then when they moved on to the next level, what do you actually need for you to be happy in your city? And it was a whole bunch of other things that weren't as simple as let's solve the traffic problem or let's solve the waste problem. It was, believe it or not, very similar. Environment, belonging, and opportunity. These three things came up. And the interesting thing is in all our research, that's what it comes down to in different countries, regardless whether it's Dubai or Mumbai. On a practical level, the situation in India specifically, and probably this is a template for other places, this is not just kind of like picking on India per se, is that the actual power and the money is at the state level or the regional level. So if you want to actually have systematic change, which is what is required in practical terms, you need to be able to work with the real decision makers and the real concentration of authority, if you like, power and money. That has to be there. The right stakeholders need to be in the room in the first place, whether that's the state governor, the big industry, etc. And then you have to look at the value chain of almost cradle to crib type thing, of what is affecting a problem like pollution. To solve a problem like pollution, you need to start thinking about electric vehicles. The price of electric vehicles is too high for India and even for Europe still. So how do you electrify, the traffic so you don't have all of this pollution? It's not going to be done overnight, but you need to change the system. That means how can we get critical mass in the number and the demand? And you could start with big industry. Companies that have fleets, for example, would be a good starting point. You'd be looking at the charging infrastructure so that people can able to charge their cars. You'd be looking at the generation of the energy that these cars are going to look at. So you need to look at the system, something like that. How can we electrify our cars so that we reduce pollution, dramatically reduce pollution? The short-term solutions tend to be around, doing clever data analytics and stuff like that, trying to model, traffic and movement and create different things like, transport and logistics vehicles can only drive at night while passenger cars only during the day, whatever. There are certain kind of mechanisms that you can apply in the short term. But the real answer is that you need to change the system. What is the big leap that your city needs to make? And if you're talking about pollution, that's definitely things like working with the most contaminating industries. Fashion is a very big industry in India. A lot of stuff gets made there. So you take that one industry and you look at what happens there.
We don't have a lot of time, and I have about 400 questions left. So I'll stick to one or two. And the first one is, you also mentioned in your presentation some of the impacts of the pandemic. If you were to choose one that you think will have a long-term or a medium-term effect on cities and city development in the future that stems from the pandemic, what would that be?
In one word, it would be decentralization. So in the past, we had this idea of city centers. We had this idea of going to an office. We had an idea that certain things can only take place within certain environments, particularly in the realm of work. So now that we're all remote and we can choose the times that we work, and quite a lot of big companies have decided to enable the workers to be remote, that will probably be and this is forever, by the way, this is not a temporary thing. That basically means that a lot of people will be able to choose the environments where they work, and they may very well leave the big city, as I mentioned earlier, and go elsewhere and go to the outskirts, go somewhere a little bit more green with a little bit more better air to breathe and an environment to breathe. So I think the almost the decoupling from power and money has to be at the city center, and actually distributing that and virtualizing that. That's definitely going to be a big thing in terms of how we live post COVID.
We have a mayor in a district in Bucharest, and who is French. So let's presume that Mr. Sidhom in the next 4-10 years decides, you know, I think I'll follow a political career, and I just want to maybe become mayor of a district or a city in a country like Romania or Poland or Serbia, so Eastern Europe, which you might be somehow familiar with in terms of, you know, these are old cities. These are cities that cannot be redesigned like that. So as a mayor, if you would be a mayor 4 years from now, what would the first 2-3 things do in Bucharest or Warsaw or Belgrade or Athens, for that matter?
I think the first thing I would do is not necessarily do a project or create a signature kind of thing that most mayors try to do. First thing I would do is that I would build an infrastructure for collaboration. You know, not an infrastructure for the city, but infrastructure for collaboration. Because the reality of the world we live in, you can't do it on your own. Not even a very powerful mayor with a lot of money. You can't do it on your own. You are going to need technology, despite what I said about them. You are going to need big business. You are going to need small business. You are going to need, you know, changes in policy. So the very first thing I would do, I would create an infrastructure for collaboration. And the second thing is I would create a culture of prototyping, actually getting small examples, small and big examples of things working. Interestingly enough, human nature being what it is, if you really want to get change, you might try and do it the way I would do it if I was a mayor. But reality is people imitate before they integrate. So if you create good, shiny examples of what could be done, then people will say, I want to do that too. And then it becomes contagious almost. You know, you create your own virus of ideas, good stuff. Yeah. And the third thing I would do, I would change procurement. Yes. Procurement in government is a disaster. It's completely upside down. It favors the big consultancies. It favors the big companies. It's incredibly hard to compete if you are a small kind of micro entrepreneur or whatnot. So I would probably create a multi-track procurement depending on the size of project and the size of opportunity that enables anyone within 48 hours to go from brief to initial solution in order to actually enact change. So these are the three things I would do. Infrastructure for collaboration.
Mr. Mayor, we
prototype and change procurement.
We have time for one very short question, so I'm going to select from I think Mariana. It's a funny question, but it's very deep actually. Can you tell us your 3 favorite cities that you would live in besides London?
Right. So the first one is Singapore. Is definitely on the top of my list. Reason being, you can say all you want about it, but if you've ever been, it's a fantastic place. It's like a civilized jungle, the expression that my students said. So everything works, but it's still very nice. The climate is amazing, and there's tons of greenery everywhere. You don't feel like you're living in a big concrete jungle. You feel like you could go to a park, climb a palm tree, whatever. And of course, it's a very organized culture. It's effectively the Switzerland of Asia. So Singapore would be one of them. The second one is one that I've lived at, which is Stockholm. I've lived in Stockholm for 5 years. And again, for a whole bunch of other reasons. The weather is not one of them, but the fact that it's an urban nature kind of archipelago type geography, as well as the system and everything else that goes with it, and the people and their approach to living, is social democracy. Really, it does work in places like Sweden. So I think, and needless to say, their response to the pandemic was much better than everybody else's. So I would say Stockholm would be the other one. The third one hasn't been created yet. The third one is more than likely going to be in about 10 years time, or even 5 years time, is going to be a floating city, because like I mentioned, the polar caps are melting and, water is going to be everywhere. I would love to live in one of the new floating cities that are being concepted and designed and talked about right now. I think it's a completely different kind of paradigm for how we would live. It would probably be powered by a small nuclear reactor. It will probably be, recycling plastic from the bottom of the sea in order to create new energy. It will probably have fantastic diet, and it will probably have amazing weather. And most importantly, you can move it from one place to another. So my third option would probably be a floating city.
I like that option as well. I like the other two options. I like you choose cities with S, but I choose cities with B usually. Berlin, Barcelona, Budapest. Thank you very much for this. It was a pleasure to have you. And there's other questions, but we'll ask them in private to you and then come back. Or if you want, in January or February, we get back online for another hour. Thanks a lot, Saher, for this. And we're moving on towards the next session.